Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And those of you that are joining virtually, thank you as well for joining today. Well, I always like to point out at the beginning that I am not a historian. There were times that I prayed to receive a D in history class as opposed to what might have been worse. But it's amazing after I was asked by my father to begin telling his story, my interest in history became very focused, and I throw some dates and locations in that I believe are correct, and if they're not, you'll please forgive me. So I'm second generation. My father, as was pointed out, was Max Glauben, who was a survivor. Second generation, you can see a family tree there, a little bit of one. He's in red on the left, Majdanek Max Glauben. His children, of which I'm the oldest, are second generation. My children are third generation, and my grandchildren, as would be my sisters and brothers' children and grandchildren, would also be second and third generation. The Holocaust, just to set the table, was the systematic and state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews from 1933 to 1945. Someone who survived that period, a Holocaust survivor, who survived the Holocaust is called a Holocaust survivor, the differentiation being that those who survived concentration camps are considered to be concentration camp survivors and Holocaust survivors. My father was born January 14th, 1928. His father, Isaac, was a newspaperman. They had a Yiddish newspaper called Das Jiddische Tagblatt. His mother, Feiga, was a homemaker, and he had a younger brother, Henrik. They lived in a 3-room, not a 3-bedroom, but a 3-room apartment in Warsaw at Mila 38 in Warsaw, Poland. He and his brother went to public school. They enjoyed math. He enjoyed music. He loved visiting with his family and playing with his brother and the neighborhood friends, and he loved playing soccer. Their life in Warsaw before the war broke out was very simple compared to what we would know today. They had meals together every night at home. There was a bakery next door which made, according to my dad, the very best crusty bread ever. And I believe he spent most of his adult life looking for something that came close. He would often send back the bread basket on the table at a restaurant and say, "Can you burn this, or can you make it more crispy?" There was a bakery next door to their family's apartment to give you an idea of the simplicity of the times, and also that the neighborhood was very orthodox, very observant of their Judaism. The bakery next door would turn off their ovens before sundown on Friday afternoon, and they would leave their doors unlocked so that the neighbors could come in. They would have prepared their evening meal, or their Sabbath meal for Saturday in a crock pot, we would call it today. It might have been a clay pot then. They would put this in the oven with the ovens off, and there'd be enough ambient heat that would cook that. And when the families were all finished with synagogue on Saturday, they would go back to the bakery, which was still unlocked, retrieve their food, and go home and have their Sabbath meal. I think we can agree that no bakery would leave their door unlocked today, especially if they knew I was in the neighborhood. When Dad was 10, the war began on September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany. And within 1 month, Warsaw was occupied. Here, my dad helps me tell the story today. So here my dad will tell you how the citizens of Warsaw learned about the invasion and what young kids did to help their community.
The war broke out on September 1st. By the time they came to Warsaw, it was around October 2nd or what. When the war broke out, the only reason we knew that it broke out was through the radio. They started talking about Germany invaded. Then, immediately, bombs falling. we set up squads of youngsters that we were trained for fire bombs, putting out, destroying fire bombs that might not have exploded, or if they exploded and there was a fire that you couldn't use water, you had to use sand. So we were setting up places on top of the roof with sand. Then we would take tape and tape the windows, cross and one in the middle this way, so when the bombs fell, that the glass wouldn't hurt us. Then we were told, if you see bombs falling, stay where you are. Never run, because if you run, that's where the bombs are going to fall.
During the occupation, life in Warsaw changed for the Jews very drastically with new laws that were implemented by the Nazis. Jews were stripped of their civil rights and their citizenship. These laws showed how that was implemented. Jewish people had to register and disclose all of their possessions. Jews had to wear a white armband with a blue star on it at all times. Later, this became a yellow star. There was no education or school for Jewish children, as they were deemed to be unclean and not to be mixed with other children. No Jewish teacher could teach. Jews were not allowed to own property. They could have their property removed or looted at any time, which included works of art, money, objects of value, such as jewelry. Professionals, doctors and lawyers, could not practice if they were Jewish. Jews could not openly pray. And there was a mass anti-Jewish propaganda, billboards, window signs, newspaper, that depicted Jews as being dangerous to German life and responsible for the social and financial difficulties in Germany. On October 12th, 1940, the Warsaw Ghetto was established, and with the money that was stolen or extorted from Jewish businesses, bricks were bought, and the Jews were forced to enclose themselves within a 1 square mile area called the Warsaw Ghetto. So the irony for me is that Jews had to build their own wall to enclose themselves with bricks purchased with money that was stolen from them. Warsaw's Jewish population was 30% of the city's total population at that time, and all of them, roughly 350,000 Jews, were moved into that 1 square mile area called the ghetto. Within the ghetto, there was little food. It had to be smuggled in, no running water, no facilities. Typhoid and other disease was running rampant. It was in epidemic proportions. Residents of the ghetto couldn't be on the streets during the day other than to go to work and back, and German soldiers would randomly shoot anyone moving in the streets during certain times of day. The very young were killed first. Why? They were the new generation. They were the ones that were going to come in and keep Judaism alive. The elderly were killed second. They had no value as a worker, and they were the respected pillars of Judaism and the community. German authorities quarantined the area, and no Germans were allowed in because of the possibility that they would become ill. A Judenreich was appointed, 2,000 Jewish policemen who enforced German laws inside the ghetto against their fellow Jews. All Jews of Warsaw were forced to move into the ghetto and bring only what they could carry. Possessions were thrown into pillowcases, bed sheets, and in the center of the bed, sometimes the bed sheets would be tied at the corners to allow more to be carried. Once all the Jews were moved into the ghetto, there were about 500,000 people in 2,700 apartments. Someone who was working in the ghetto got a ration card which allowed them 184 calories a day, for which they waited in long lines. The bag of potato chips that we might have had at lunch has about 184 calories in it. That was the daily ration. Anyone could be rounded up at any time to be taken to Majdanek or Treblinka, both of which were death camps. And the food lines made it easy to get people at once. So even though people might have been waiting in line for a long time to get their food, when the trucks came around, those lines scattered because death was worse than hunger. Here, my dad will detail what he saw and experienced in the Warsaw Ghetto.
I don't know if a person can imagine living in an apartment with clothing that is wore out in shreds, where somebody can only wash themselves with a piece of rag that might be wore out, or in the wintertime, heavenly, with some snow that you bring in and put in the bathtub, or in a sink that you close up because there's no running water, and maybe that's fresher than the water from the Wisla that they sometimes let you bring in. Rodents, rats, because you're not living too much in your apartment, but because of the raids, you do it in the basement that you create as a hiding place. I don't know if you can describe a child and an elderly person that is not allowed to live because they are the victims and they are free game. And let's say they hide and the parents are being taken out, taken away to either Treblinka or Majdanek, and they don't have anybody to care for them. So they live in that apartment and they sit next to each other and they pick their lice out of their hair. And they see something that's moving and maybe they eat it. And then the people that they live in die, and there aren't enough people or undertakers to take the bodies out to the street or to the cemetery. There were handmade cars to carry the bodies to the cemetery. The cemetery had a big grave in the front because there was no room or no equipment to dig graves. There were children lying on the street, skin and bones, because a sweet way to go was freeze by the elements in the wintertime, or die by the elements only. There were mothers with children singing because they went berserk because of the treatment and the hunger that they were. There were people walking and saying why and praying, scenes that are unbelievable, because that's what happens when you live under these conditions.
In the ghetto, kids became smugglers to bring in food, which was brought in hollowed out areas of carts. Day became night because it was easier to smuggle at night, and basements and cellars became bomb shelters. My father was one of the children who helped smuggle food and messages in and out of the ghetto, and here he is talking about what he did.
That's how I got involved in the smuggling. They had a wagon and a brown, beautiful horse called Lalka, which was a dog in Polish. And my father knew the owner, so he worked a little bit there. And a lot of us were messengers with a buy for the next shipment to be smuggled into the ghetto. Couldn't communicate, no telephones, or couldn't use the telephones. No way. So I would get an envelope, and I wouldn't know what was in the envelope. Could have been money, could have been an arrangement to buy something, and I would deliver this to a certain spot there. Now sometimes they had somebody that was watching and I couldn't do it, but most of the time I was able to manipulate something. And then I would go out on these trips. I can't tell you how many. Sometimes they used me, sometimes they didn't use me, and sometimes I ran across the gates with a long coat, and sometimes I went through the sewers, but it was done more for the unit that we lived in. Do you understand? Smuggling was a defined act of fighting against the Germans. That wasn't cowardly. We were saving lives.
On April 19th, 1943, there were orders to liquidate the ghetto. The ghetto inhabitants for 1 month until mid-May, with no real weapons, managed to keep the German forces out of the ghetto until the Germans came in with napalm and flamethrowers. The only place to hide at that point was basements, and there were dogs sniffing out those that were hiding, and grenades were thrown in to force people out when they were found hiding. Also, the Nazis used listening devices to detect where people were hiding. Dad hid behind the oven in the bakery next door to his apartment, that same oven that made the delicious crusty breads and cooked his neighborhood Sabbath meals. When people were found alive, they were stripped and searched, and they were taken to a makeshift train station called the Umschlagplatz, and they were put on boxcars to either Majdanek or Treblinka, 2 death camps. The Kapo, or German police, were told to send 500 people a day because the death camps each could only handle 250 per day. No boxcar left with fewer than 100 people in it, and Dad and his family were sent to Majdanek. The trip from Warsaw to Majdanek, which would take about 2 hours by train if done today, took 5 days because regular train service stayed on schedule. Those trains were also carrying arms. They were carrying provisions for the soldiers. They were carrying soldiers themselves. And the Jewish boxcars at that point were placed on side rails or spurs to allow the regular train traffic to pass. In this clip, my father tells of the conditions he experienced during his deportation.
So there's a lot of people, and you see some of the Jewish couples there and some Germans with guns and bayonets, and you are nobody, and you get mingled up, and I don't even know whether, I know that my little brother was with me, but I don't know where he was by the time we were loaded into the boxcar, because like you're going into a theater or you're coming out of a theater and you might be there with your spouse, and then somebody walks in right in the middle and they were pushing you in, and we were being loaded not on a platform but a 4x8 plywood with some 2x4s or 1x1s on there. So once you get on there and you do slide down, you don't go to the end, you can still climb up. And then the boxcars sometimes had rubbish on there, body parts, the clothing parts, and they might have taken 2 or 3 or 4 trips. They never washed them. The smell impregnated in the wood because there were no toilets on there, no water. That's what I described, you know. So we finally were pushed on there, and then the door locked from the outside.
When the boxcars arrived at Majdanek, there was a 1.5 kilometer walk, about a mile from the train to the camp, and they did this marching. Upon arrival, everyone went through selection. With the flick of the thumb, able-bodied men were sent one direction, women and children and the infirmed were sent another direction to buildings marked Brasabad, bathhouse, and disinfecting house to prevent hysteria, and that was written on the outside of what were actually gas chambers. Dad later learned that his mom and his brother both were killed that day. My father will explain how his family got separated at Majdanek.
So when they started selecting, they said women and children forward, and all the men there were left. I was next to my father, and my mom and her brother and all my other relatives. So when they went ahead, I went with them. And my father grabbed my hand, stay with me. And I was pretty close to his size, and the Germans allowed it. Then they put us into a portable building, and I don't remember how long I stood there. But overnight, that night, slept just on the floor. There were like sheds, portable buildings. They didn't have any toilets or food or anything. You just lay there, and we had clothing that was unbelievable and filled after 5 days. Anyways, then was either the next day or, to be true, I cannot, time does not mean anything, just light and dark, light and dark. And then we were taken on another boxcar and taken to Budzin.
As Dad said, a day or two later, he and his father were sent to Budzin, which was a work camp in Poland. There were two types of camps, actually a few more than that, but basically there were death camps whose sole job was to exterminate the Jews. And then there were work camps, and these were camps set up strictly for slave labor. Certainly people died there, but they died of lack of nutrition or overwork or exposure to the elements, but they were always associated with a nearby industry which supported the Nazi war effort. Budzin had about 3,000 prisoners, and it was next to a Heinkel airplane factory. Upon arrival, my father and his father and all of the prisoners were sent to a big room with overhead showers. Dad and the other prisoners were stripped, they were sprayed with lye soap, and they were rinsed with a big fire hose. There was death by trampling, by the water pressure from the fire hose, and those that survived were sent to the next room, sprayed with DDT, and given random clothing which did not fit. Dad and his dad at that point were asked if they could read blueprints to make pattern for airplane parts, and of course the answer had to be yes, or the outcome would not have been good. That actually began his career as a pattern maker in several subsequent camps. Budzin was in the charge of Commander Fikes, who was particularly brutal. There was reveille every morning in the Appellplatz, which was the central meeting area between all of the barracks. All of the prisoners were counted, and they had to wait for Commander Fikes to arrive, and he would accept the count. They could be waiting in 0-degree weather for 2 to 3 hours, and those who fell went to the dispensary, which was code word for out the back door into a ditch. Fikes would ride his horse behind the prisoners, singling one or two out to whip to death, saying that bullets were too good. Dad became a pattern maker for Heinkel Airplane Factory, and they marched in sections from the camp to the factory based on their assignments at Heinkel. You went to the outhouse on a schedule. You went back to camp for lunch on a schedule, marching in cadence and singing all the while, and failure to do that resulted in death. They would eat one piece of bread a day and some soup of varying nutritional value based on what was available. He often described potato peel soup. This is where my father's dad died, and I will let Dad tell you more about that.
It was about 3 weeks into the camp when we went out on a Friday morning and came back in the evening, and they miscounted some people and stated that there were 3 people missing. My father was taken as a hostage. And what I never say, but I had a very high temper. And my father kept on saying, Moniak, lose your temper, be calm. Because you like people like right now when I'm driving, my wife says, be careful, no, don't. So I learned how to control it after that. He says, when they took him away from me, he says, you will survive, but lose your temper. Those are the last words, and ever since then, I became more at ease, but still, don't mess with me, because I still, have it in there. So, when he was taken a hostage, he was holding my hand, and they took him away from me, and I wanted to go with him, and no way, when we want you, we'll let you know when we want you. So they laid him out on the ground in the middle of the Appel Square with the face down. And I know there was another man that was from Warsaw. I don't know his name, but I can see his face right now. And he must have been laying next to my father or what. It was Friday night. I went into the barracks, crying. I don't know if I remember if I slept or not. When we got up Saturday morning to go to work, half of the bodies were gone, and only the shoes, and my father's shoes, which were boots, were there.
A little bit more detail. The rule was that for everyone who escaped or tried to escape from that camp, 10 hostages would be taken in their place. Dad described that there was a miscount, and instead of the correct number, there were 3 short, and so his father was selected as one of 30 prisoners, hostages, who were executed. They were laid shoulder to shoulder, 10, 10, and 10, and someone stood at the opening of the U so that they could execute. As it turned out, the 3 missing appeared, and the executions were ceased, and so only about half of those died. But when my father woke the next morning, his father had been one, and all that remained where his body had been the night before were his father's boots. He was sent to Mielec next. There was an engineer in charge of this camp, and he continued to be a pattern maker for yet another Heinkel airplane factory. This is where he received his tattoo. It was a KL on his right forearm. This was done single-handedly with one needle by hand. 1,500 people total received that tattoo. Only 61 survived the war. Something I learned recently is that only 2 camps actually tattooed prisoners. You've seen and heard, many of you have, about Auschwitz, which had a number and had numbers and letters which identified the person instead of their name. Here, the KL stood for Konzentrationslager, which is German for concentration camp, meaning property of the camp. It was the only other. Those were the 2 camps. Mielec and Auschwitz-Birkenau were the only 2 camps which did the tattoos. After he left Mielec, he was then sent briefly to a camp called Wieliczka, which was in a salt mine. Today it's still a UNESCO site. It's still an operational salt mine. And they built a Messerschmitt factory underground, a production factory that never really got off the ground. Dad described it as being a camp in chaos. There were no barracks, no beds. There were fields of bodies that were dead or dying. Nobody was able to sleep. There was no food. There were not enough facilities. And he was only there for about 2 or 3 weeks, at which point 2,700 able-bodied workers were transported then to the final camp that he was in called Flossenburg. He arrived August 4th, 1944, and he was there until April 16th, 1945. He was housed in Block 11. Flossenburg is to this day an operational granite quarry, and the stone that was mined there was used to build the grand Nazi buildings that you've seen on documentaries and photos in books. But by 1945, late 1944, and by 1945, the Nazis needed far more airplanes than they needed buildings. So 2 wooden barracks were built on the grounds of the quarry, and that became a Messerschmitt production facility. And he worked again as a pattern maker in that facility. As the war was ending, and due to the advancing Allied forces from the north and the east, the Nazis wanted to destroy evidence of the treatment of the prisoners at the camp, and they began to move all able-bodied prisoners towards Dachau on a series of what became known as death marches. There was only one Jewish death march which left Flossenburg, and it left on April 16th, 1945. Here my dad will detail the moment that their train was met by American planes.
The train consisted of enough boxcars to hold about 2,400 Jewish people, guards in the doorway guarding us, 2 locomotives, one in the front and one in the back. The moment the train leaves, and I think they described it around Schwarzenfeld, Germany, the American fighter planes came and shut up the train parallel, disabled both locomotives, killed the Germans that were standing in the doorways, and they thought it was a train of German soldiers. I was kneeling down inside the boxcar, and I ended up with brains and body parts of human beings all over me. They took us out of the boxcar, all bloody. They put us on another train. That train leaves, come the British. They disable the 2 locomotives, then start diving down, and we see the Germans looking, and you see every 5th bullet is like a firecracker. It tells the pilot whether they're hitting the object or not. The Germans see them coming, they jump off, and of course we jump off. By the time we lay down on the ground, the pilots see who is really in the cars. They just kill a few of us, fire a few of the shots, and fly away.
I want to point out real quickly, my son and I were able to go to Flossenburg 3 years ago, and one of the missions that we had was to try to locate. Dad had always spoken about the hill on which he was liberated, and you'll hear about that in a second. We were able to get a copy of this sketch, which shows there were no photographs taken of that death march, but somebody in a town had done a sketch. And in this sketch, you see the German officer on the horse, and you see all the prisoners marching. And off to the right, you see the extended arm of a German officer shooting someone in a trench. We saw mass graves that are still there today. They're trying to be, the remains are trying to be relocated. But if you see in the photo, there's a sketch of a tower. That's the actual tower. We saw it in person, so we knew we were in the right place at that time. After the train was disabled, the death march continued on foot. The prisoners came to a hilly area in a town called Stamsried, and they were led to the top of the hill and told by German officers to stay there, and that they were surrounded below by soldiers with rifles, and that if anyone tried to run down the hill to escape, they would be shot on sight. Here my dad talks about the moments leading up to his liberation and the first experience with American soldiers.
So about 7 or 8 of us tested our legs after we heard a roar of engines back in the town. And what it did see that we could watch one machine gun, but we didn't know how many there were there. But we saw the Germans tearing off the SS insignias and tearing off some of the stripes to make the uniforms seem like no ranks and that they weren't who they were. And we saw them getting away, but we didn't know it was kind of far away and there was vegetation, so you can see movement and maybe something doing something, but like in between the thing. When we heard the roar, 7 or 8 of us decided that we are going to try to run through the machine guns, because singularly we would be dead ducks. So we tested, and then we started, so we ran back into the town. When we got to the bottom, it was American tanks. And then all the German windows were open, and people, white bed sheets, pillowcases out of the window, they were surrendering to the American soldiers. So they felt like if they stand up, nobody's going to kill them. They thought they're going to be killed.
The prisoners were abandoned in the German countryside on April 21st, 1945. After 2 days of wandering, looking for a displaced or DP camp, displaced persons camp, on April 23rd, 1945, they encountered 3rd U.S. Army 90th Division 179 Signal Repair Corps, which came down the road. In charge of that was 2nd Lieutenant Bessick, who encountered the small group of 8 young men, my father being one of them, and said, "You kids aren't going to make it in a DP camp, and I'm not going to let you die." He adopted the small group. He gave them U.S. Army uniforms, and they roamed with the Corps. Lieutenant Bessick called them his helpers. The Corps took over an empty cable works factory, Neumeier Cable Works factory in Nuremberg, and he stayed with the U.S. forces there for 2 years. He learned English, he bought his first car, he wore an American uniform, and he learned to cook for 600 German POWs and 200 Polish guards. 2 years later, in 1947, the troops were sent elsewhere, and Dad was actually sent to an orphanage, a Gloucestershausen orphanage, and while he was there, he got to play soccer again. Someone from the children's service asked him to help transport some orphaned infants from that orphanage to the United States for adoption, and when he said yes, it ensured his immediate passage. There was no line, and he came to the United States mid-December 1947 with those babies on a converted merchant ship, the USS Marine Flasher, to New York through Ellis Island, and he lived in a boarding house in the Bronx. Hate's not a good word, but he did not like New York, So he asked to be moved, and he was sent to Atlanta on an Eastern Airlines plane on New Year's Eve, 1947, and he lived there in a foster home. When he turned 18, he received his permanent visa, registered for the draft in 1948. He was drafted into the U.S. Army, sent to Fort Hood, where he served from 1951 to 1953 on active duty. The experience he had cooking for 800 people a day while in Nuremberg served him well as he became a mess sergeant at Fort Hood. While in Fort Hood, he used to come to Dallas for R&R on the weekends with some of his soldier buddies. He met my mom at a dance, and they married June 14th, 1953. I was born a year later, followed by my sister 3 years later, and another brother 6 years after that. From my parents' marriage, there were 3 kids, 7 grandkids, and as of 10 months ago, 4 great-grandkids, the 4th named Max Glauben. And we have about 29 or 30 that came from Dad. He enjoyed pointing out that Hitler had not gotten him and that there were now 30 standing with him. Thank you. So with barely a 4th grade education, he went on to build a very successful business. He was a beloved father, grandfather, and even great-grandfather, and he pledged to himself that he would tell his story to all who would listen so that an event like the Holocaust would not happen again. He helped found this museum, which tells not only the story of the Holocaust, but other genocides which have occurred. He was awarded an honorary doctorate degree from SMU. He was selected as Dallas Morning News Texan of the Year in 2020. He saw his biography published in 2021 called The Upstander. And he was selected by this museum to be filmed using holographic technology, where he has permanent residence today in the Dimensions and Testimony exhibit, where even past his death, he can answer about 2,000 questions in the museum's special theater. Most important to him, he was awarded the Dallas Holocaust Museum's Hope for Humanity Award in November 2021, just 5 months before his death, April 28th, 2022, on Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Day of Remembrance. Dad would not want you to feel pity for him after hearing his story. Instead, he would want you to learn some important lessons from the story. I'll share a couple of those favorites with you now. He would always tell his student groups, God gave us the most powerful computer, our brain. And he told students that you're in charge of programming yours. Program it for understanding, compassion, and doing good deeds. A few years ago, he was at Auschwitz on an educational trip, and he saw several German shepherds guiding vision-impaired visitors. He asked to take a picture with them and the dogs, and when he was asked why, he said, in the camps, these German shepherds were trained to maim and kill upon command, and now these same German shepherds have been trained to be helpful. He thought people could be educated similarly. At Majdanek, in the back of the former death camp, today a museum and memorial site, among the trenches where people were shot and pushed into mass graves, there's a mausoleum pictured here. Under that dome, open air, are 17 tons of ashes, bone, and teeth excavated from the trenches on the grounds there at Majdanek. He called this the Mound of Lost Opportunity. In these and other ashes, who might have cured cancer? Who might have written the great novel? Who might have solved the problem of homelessness or mental illness? He said that we would never realize the potential that rests here. So for me, it doesn't seem enough to tell Dad's story without thinking why it's important to tell it, as well as the story of the other survivors. Dad would have said that it's because the Holocaust can happen again. For me, the stories serve as a reminder of how cruel and mean one person can be to another, given the right circumstances, and how each of us need to actively confront hate or prejudice when we see it. Dad's is one of millions of stories of those who endured World War II. Each story is different. Some had better outcomes than others. But all of the things I described that happened to Dad and his family happened only for one reason, because they were Jewish. They weren't criminals. They weren't murderers. They were Jewish. The most powerful way to explain why we must continue to tell these stories came to me actually through a cartoon. This cartoon that Dad had posted above his desk. The cartoon, written on Yom HaShoah in 2002, shows an old man sitting on a park bench next to a young child, and they're talking. The child says, "Mister, that's an awfully boring tattoo on your arm. It's just a bunch of numbers." The old man replies, "I was just about your age when I got it, and I kept it as a reminder." The child says, "Oh, a reminder of happier days?" The man replied, "No, of a time when the world went mad." He continued, "Imagine yourself in a land where your countrymen followed the voice of political extremists who didn't like your religion. Imagine how everything was taken from you, your entire family sent to a concentration camp as slave laborers, then systematically murdered. At the camp, they even take your name and replace it with a number tattooed on your arm. It was called the Holocaust when millions of people perished just because of their faith." The child, now shown crying, said, "So you kept it to remind yourself about how horribly one person can treat another?" And the old man replied, "No, my dear child, I kept it to remind you." Thank you so much for being a witness today. My father always said, if you encounter and hear a story from a witness, you become a witness. So now, even though not entirely from my dad, some from me, you are witnesses, and we hope that the best outcome will come from your having heard this story today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Are we on? There we go. Thank you, Phil, again for sharing your father's story and your story. We're going to do our Q&A now. I ask in the audience, if you have a question, please write it on your card and then hold it in the air, and one of our volunteers will come and grab it from you. And while we wait on that, I have a few already that came in from online.
Great, thank you.
What was the earliest time your father spoke to you regarding his past?
Growing up, I knew my mom had told us that we were children of a Holocaust survivor, but honestly, we did not know what that meant. I graduated from high school in 1972, and I believe that was the year that the movie The Holocaust came on TV, and that opened the floodgates, not just for my dad, but there were about 40 or so survivors living in Dallas at the time, and I had met many of them, and that was when the very first museum came into formation. It was in the basement of the Jewish Community Center on North Haven. Then it became down, and now we're in this fantastic facility. So it was probably, I was just finishing high school and preparing to go to college when I first learned what that actually meant from him.
And say, I thank your father for that, because I was one of those kids that went to the one in the JCC.
Fantastic. Wow. Full circle for you, too.
It is. All right. What strength do you take from your father's story?
What strength?
Mm-hmm.
I told you the story about being a terrible history student. One of the things that Dad told my sister and my brother and myself when we were growing up was, get your education. It's the one thing they can't take away. And we didn't really know who the they was in the they taking it away. It's evident to me now, and education, for me and for my siblings and for my children and hopefully for my grandkids, 3 of whom are already in some type of school. Education is the main thing. He always said that love is not the cure to hate, but education and understanding. And I took that very much to heart from him.
Next question. What is your favorite memory of your father?
Oh, gosh. So, in a weird kind of way, it was later in life. We had oddly enough, my daughter, who's now 40, and she was the one who could talk to her Zadie about the Holocaust. She could ask him questions and he wouldn't be intimidated. He enjoyed those conversations. And I was a little bit jealous of that, to be honest, because he had never had those conversations with us. The first time that I call it walking in his footsteps, I got to go on March of the Living with him in 2015, and my daughter went as well. So there were 3 generations of us together. And as we got there, and we were, it wasn't March of the Living, it was in Germany. And he said, as he was looking around, he said, I've never been to Germany. This is an absolutely beautiful country, and it's hard to imagine that such ugly things happened in such a beautiful place. And just that opened the floodgates. And on that trip to March of the Living, and then fast forward 3 years ago, I got to go with him 8 times to Flossenburg, the camp from which he was liberated. And when we were away from our life in Dallas, we were actually able to have those difficult conversations, and he opened up. I won't say that he was very emotional about it. He always hid his emotions and dealt with them privately, but we were able to have conversations that I always had wanted to have when I was younger, and he was too. So I'm thankful that I got to walk with him in those places and have conversations with him, and those were very meaningful times.
I have so many side questions for you later about that.
Probably explains a lot.
Speaking of his dealing with emotions, and you talked about, his father told him to remain calm, and how did he keep his cool? And with that, did he hate the Germans after the Holocaust?
I'm not going to lie and say that there weren't times that he said, we don't buy German things, we don't go to Germany, but I think after the first time he went to Flossenburg, which had to be 15 or so years ago, being in Germany and seeing, number one, the respect with which so Flossenburg today, the granite quarry is still operational, and it's adjacent to what had been the camp. That's all, the geography is still the same, but life has moved on, and the buildings that were not damaged by the end of the war, now the old SS building is the memorial site, staffing headquarters. The old casino building, which had nothing to do with gambling, is now a multimedia education and learning center, which is incredible. The former washateria and cafeteria are now permanent exhibitions. The barracks were destroyed at the end of the war. In 1958, the German government gave that land to squatters if they would build homes there. So it feels like bad karma to me to have this beautiful home on the former site of a Holocaust site, barracks, and you can still see the chimney. The crematorium at Flossenburg is still there. You can see the chimney from some areas of that. But when he got there and he realized that, number one, Germany had made attempts in later years to make amends and to own up to the role that they had played as a country. You know, not everybody, not every time. But when he realized the respect that his pain had been given, I think it was transformational for him in a way. And he went back several times.
Your father's story is a great one.
Thank you.
Question, what did your father do for work?
Well, when he, so my history with him, I understand that he, when he came to the United States, he opened a grocery in Atlanta, a little grocery store. I actually found a tax return from that and cleaning out some of his effects. And when he enlisted, he had a job in a shoe store selling shoes. And interestingly, I learned only recently that after he and Mom married, he had an offer from that shoe store, and he moved to Birmingham for a very brief time. There was, well, I'm just going to say it. There was a lot of KKK activity in the area at the time, and his shoe store was invaded by a group who came in and plastered labels all over shoe boxes and caused some damage, and they were back in Dallas pretty quickly. And when he came back, his first job when I was born was he was the toy buyer for Neiman Marcus, the flagship store, which is sadly about to close. I have some pretty cool things in the attic from that, by the way. And he stayed in the toy business. He was hired away to manage a toy distributorship, and he ultimately went into business with an uncle, and I joined them, and the uncle left, and Dad and I operated a supply business together for 25 years, sold it in 2004 when he retired, and I just retired from that 20 years later last year. So it was always, he was always a great provider, always very industrious. He was there at 4 a.m. I wasn't going to do that.
Fair. All right, final question. What gives you hope?
Well, I'll admit it's a little hard to find right now. But I do find hope from looking at little Natalie and Millie and Julian and Max and seeing their innocence and seeing that they're, my wife and I are constantly immersed in the news on TV, and I just had a conversation with somebody in the lobby beforehand, and the question was, what did your dad think about recent times? And I pointed out that in the last 7 or 8 years of his life, he saw some of the political things playing out on TV, and I think his words were, this is as close as I've seen it to what I've seen before. And it was real tough. It's still tough not to get wrapped up in that. But seeing young people, I have the privilege of speaking to youth groups here at the museum often, and feeling that energy gives me hope.
Our children are our future.
I hope so.
Well, thank you. Thank you again for sharing your father's story.
You bet, and thank you. And thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We will continue this series both in person here at the museum as well as online virtually in Zoom through next week. Our next speaker is also a second-generation speaker, survivor Mark Jacobs. He is the son of the other museum co-founder, Mike Jacobs. We hope that you will join us. And if you would like to meet Phil, you can welcome to come up on stage and meet him afterwards. We thank you again for coming today.